Kelly, as well as live streaming all of our presentations on Facebook and YouTube. All of our presentations are also recorded, so you can view them on our YouTube channels at a later date as well. There will be a question and answer session at the end of tonight's presentation. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you're joining via Zoom. And if you're joining via Facebook or YouTube, please use the comment section and we'll make sure that we look at those as well. We would love to thank the generous sponsors that make our Naturalist Nights possible. These businesses provide financial and in-kind donations to cover expenses. Tonight's sponsor is Ken Ranford of Ken Ransford PC. Thank you so much, Ken, for your support. The next Naturalist Nights speaker presentation will be in person, fingers crossed, here at Hallam Lake in 2 weeks on Thursday, February 10th at 6 p.m. And it will also be live streamed. Dan West is a forest entomologist for Colorado State Forest Service at Colorado State University, and he will be presenting on forest disturbance by bark beetles in Colorado. And now I am so excited to introduce tonight's speaker, a good friend and ACES alum, Dr. Courtland Kelly. Dr. Kelly is a researcher of soil health at Colorado State University. She has where she investigated the role of regenerative agriculture practices in soil health and soil organisms, including at a small study plot, which we'll hear about at Rock Bottom Ranch. Her work focuses mainly on the feedbacks between plants, soil, and soil organisms. Before she did her PhD, Dr. Kelly completed her undergraduate degree in evolutionary biology at Harvard University and worked at ACES as a summer naturalist and winter naturalist. We were winter naturalists together 8 years ago, and it is so wonderful to welcome Courtland tonight to share her research with us. Welcome, Courtland.
So much, Phoebe, for that great introduction.
You're very welcome. Where are you joining us from, Courtland, tonight?
I'm in Fort Collins, and we also had a little bit of snow this morning as well, so feeling very wintry, which is lovely.
Excellent. Well, you sound great and look great, and so I will turn it over to you.
Great. All right, well, hi everyone. It's so wonderful to be here today. So great to see some familiar faces and kind of come full circle to be back here with ACES after completing my graduate studies. So today I'm so excited to talk about a topic that is very close to my heart. I find it not only extremely important, but also extremely fascinating. And so I'm hoping that during my talk today, I'll be able to convince you not only that we should be thinking, about soil carbon more, but also that it's just a truly fascinating, and we can all nerd out together. All right, so getting started here. So a bit about me. I feel like, oftentimes we have these ideas of scientists as being older white men in lab coats. And so I like to kind of share a little bit about my journey of how I got here to be a soil scientist. So as Phoebe mentioned, when I did my undergraduate degree in evolutionary biology, and I really focused on plants. And I was interested in how climate change, even what we've seen sort of in our warming already, has affected the flowering times of plants in Massachusetts. And so we used a cool data set where we looked at old records from Thoreau in his time in his cabin to look at the effects of our current warming on flowering times. I then made my way to ACES, where I was a summer and winter naturalist, and really fell in love with the whole ecosystem perspective and kind of opened my eyes to the importance of considering all the different elements of the ecosystem, the hydrologic, the water regimes, the kind of geology. And so with that and some interest and some time spent doing some urban farming work, I decided to pursue my PhD at Colorado State University, where I studied how different types of conservation or kind of sustainable or regenerative agriculture practices affected the way that soil functioned and the interaction between management, plants, the soil, and also soil microbes. I'm not going to be speaking too much directly about my research during my dissertation today, but what was really kind of a grounding principle in all of that was soil health. And soil health, as defined sort of by the current government agencies, it's the continuing capacity of our soils to function. And that really allows us to capture the variability of soils across the landscape and the different functions. And today we're going to kind of go in and kind of nerd out on what variability and how soils are formed. But a key tenet of soil health is soil carbon, which is a component of soil organic matter. And so that's what we're going to be talking about a lot today. So I'm really excited to delve into that with you. So that was a little bit about me. We unfortunately don't have too much time to hear from you directly, though I'd love to hear comments in the chats if you want to kind of put in your chat what your relationship is with soil. So whether you're a gardener, a farmer, you maybe work in construction, do some landscaping, or you just like to spend time outside, or you simply are standing on the earth. We all are interacting with soil in some capacity, eating and benefiting from all of the services that soil provides. So throughout this presentation, we're going to be kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of soil science. But I think it's important to also keep in mind that we have these interactions every day, and we really owe a lot to this material that is generally ignored because it's beneath our feet. So why soil carbon today? We're talking about soil carbon because, as I'm sure you're all aware, we're in the midst of a climate crisis, and many of us, including our policymakers, luckily, are concerned about rising carbon dioxide and other pollutants and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And this executive order that I'm showing here on the screen is highlighting that even the president's office is looking to soils, specifically in our agricultural systems and our managed lands, as an avenue to sequester carbon. And when I talk about sequestering carbon, I mean taking some of the carbon that's in the atmosphere, most of it as carbon dioxide, but some as other forms, and fixing it into generally biological material, so living things, and sequestering it somewhere, though there are some other forms of sequestration that are not biological that we're looking at. So there's a lot of interest in Washington, D.C., as also at the state level, and at the end of my presentation, I'll mention some of the work that Colorado is doing to try to incentivize soil carbon sequestration in our agricultural systems. In addition, or sort of as kind of a complement to the political will around increasing soil carbon, there's also growing market incentives. So you might have heard of ecosystem service markets or carbon markets. And these are kind of different ways that different entities are trying to incentivize sequestering carbon in different places. But a huge part of making carbon markets a reality is being able to measure them. And we're going to be getting into that later in the presentation. But it is among the soil science community, it's a huge question of how to accurately and robustly measure the carbon that we're trying to store. So kind of backing up a little bit, I've talked a bit about soil, but let's just get back to our basics here. These might be familiar to some of you, but to others it may not be, or a nice review. So I think it's always fun to just get back to basics. So what is soil? Soil is a mixture of different materials. And what's really great about soil is it has all these different components. So on the bottom half of the circle here, you can see that we're looking at pore space. So this is water and air that's in our soil. It's in the soil, but it doesn't have any mass. And you can imagine that based on how wet or dry your soil is, those relative proportions are going to change. The top half of the circle is what we think about the soil that has mass, and that's our inorganic mineral matter. So that's what we call it, our mineral soil, and that's our rock-derived, non-living material. And then this little slice right here is our organic matter. We're calling it organic matter because it's it's intentionally vague. It has a wide diversity of chemical compounds. And to be completely honest, we don't really know what it is. It's very hard to study, as you have probably observed. Soil is, you can't see through it very well. So this is an area that is an active area of research, but just because we don't know it, we can't tell you exactly what it is. We have a lot of great ideas, a lot of good evidence to show an evolution in our thinking based on new techniques that we've been able to develop and apply to soil. And I highlight here, so this is our organic matter. This is the part of the soil where the carbon, carbon that we manage, where the organic carbon lives. And so this is the kind of slice that we care about trying to increase. But as it's written here, there's a separation between the inorganic and the organic, but really in soil, soil is a hybrid of geologic and biological material. And a good sort of way to frame this and kind of think about the importance of this kind of blended hybrid material is when you think about the scales of soil formation. So how does soil form? Well, first, rock that's formed deep in the crust gets exposed to the atmosphere. And the conditions on the Earth's surface are completely different than that in the Earth's crust. And so as soon as rock is exposed to the atmosphere, it starts to weather. Through rain and water and living things, we start disintegrating the rock, and that exposed rock, or we call parent material, begins to break down. And a lot of the minerals or things we think about as fertilizer are actually components of that geologic material. And as it's weathered and broken down, it gets released, it dissolves into the soil solution or the water that's in the soil and becomes available for plants. And then certain plants in that sort of, young stage are able to grow. So you might be familiar with mosses and lichens, kind of small plants that are able to grow in this newly formed soil. Over time, the soil will develop, more weathering or disintegration will take place, and we see additions of organic matter or dead plant and animal material that gets added to the soil and blends and forms that soil organic matter that I mentioned. And then sort of finally, we consider a well-developed soil, which has this different horizonation or layers and generally has fairly good fertility, though as soils develop even further, can start losing fertility as those elements get washed away. And so the way I have it written here is sort of a linear process, but the rate at which this happens and to what degree, as well as other factors, depend on particular conditions that the soil develops. And so if you remember nothing else from this talk today about the introduction to soil formation, I want you to try to remember this acronym, which I have up at the top here in the top right, CLORPT, with a little H on the end. And so CLORPT is our soil science acronym for these words here. These are all the factors that that come together to determine soil formation. We have the climate, so that's going to be the temperature and the moisture regime, the organisms that are living in the area, the relief or topography, so that's kind of the slope position. Is it on a hill slope? Is it kind of in a valley? The parent material, which I mentioned before, and that can be either rock or can also be sediments that are moved by the river, and then time. So all of these things sort of come together, and so in an individual time and place, for example, in your backyard or in some place that's special to you, if you go there and you explore that soil is going to be unique to that particular place because of these 5 factors. What I've added in gray is the human factor, and that is what many soil scientists think is now appropriate to add to this formula. And that's because humans have changed so much of our environment, including the atmosphere, the climate already, as well as the biological composition of plants and animals, that the human influence is now considered a major part of soil formation as well. So CLORPT, it is a fairly simple thing to kind of think about, But once you kind of put it into action and really think about the intricacies of it, you can realize that the way like your soil in each individual space is like a unique fingerprint in that area. And that soil might only exist in that one place. So I have here on the left, just I think I found this really nice diagram that I think helps to illustrate how one or two, how each of these factors kind of by themselves can affect soil formation. So without going into too much detail, you can just see really nicely that in the top left, when you have a polar area, there's nothing growing, you're not going to have much soil formation. As we move to the right, in a temperate area, you can see that the soil is moderately deep and has a fairly rich topsoil. And so we have sort of moderate temperatures, moderate precipitation that's leading to the formation of that soil. In the desert, unsurprisingly, you have little rain and little biological activity. And so your soil is going to be really poorly developed and very thin. And then we move on to the tropical, which has a high rate of weathering. And so a lot of those minerals are leached out or kind of washed away from the soil because of the high amount of rain that area gets and high levels of decomposition or how fast things kind of rot and cycle back into the atmosphere. On the bottom, you can also see a diagram as well. This is demonstrating parent material and how different forms of parent material can affect the thickness of soil. But an important thing that's not really diagrammed here is that it also affects the sort of particles and the chemistry of the soil. So these are kind of some neat demonstrations I think help to solidify what I mean of why when we go to a desert, we see a really different soil than when we go to a tropical rainforest versus a temperate grassland, temperate forest. So some important points, right? Soils take a long time to develop. They're a little bit faster than sort of geologic time. Soils will develop in sort of hundreds to thousands of year time frame. So it's sort of in the intermediate between the biological timeline, which is, seasons to maybe hundreds of years at the most. And then, you have geologic time on the other side, which is millions, millions and billions of years. So soils are sort of somewhere in the middle, and it makes sense because they're that mixture, as I mentioned before, of both geological material and biological material. Because of all these factors that come together to form a soil in a specific place, soils are highly unique. And in the US alone, there are 14,000 individually described soil series. I like to think of soil series as like a species. So, if you're familiar with how plant taxonomy works, you have flowering plants, and then you can sort of go into different families. You go to the rose family, and then you could go all the way to apple tree, right? So soils are classified in a similar way, where soils that are sort of vaguely similar. So all grassland soils, for example, are considered mollisols. And then as you get into kind of more specific to a particular climate or region or parent material, you're going to get a more specific, taxonomic class. So one thing I want to sort of share that I thought was fun is that every state in the US has a state soil, and the Colorado state soil is a sites soil, and that exists mostly in Southwest Colorado. And you can see here it has a really distinct horizonation and a nice thick dark topsoil layer. But something that's all similar to our biological species is that soils, because they're so unique to an area, they are not only endangered because of soil loss and erosion and other kinds of human-caused disturbance, but they can also go extinct. And that's, I think, something that we don't really think about as a non-sort of biological entity going extinct. But it's true, there are certain soils in parts of the world that don't exist anymore. And this has huge implications for our living processes. There are some soils that support specific plants and animals. And then also, zooming into the soil microbes, there are lots of soil microbes that we haven't even described yet. And so we could be losing a lot of biodiversity through the soil that we haven't even discovered yet, and have the potential for, for helping us, but also just contributing to the diversity of life on Earth. Okay, so something I mentioned in here is the texture of soil. And so I'm going to briefly remind us that there are different sizes of mineral particles. There's sand, silt, and clay. Sand is the largest. We can sort of feel it in our fingers. It's gritty. Silt is smoother. It's less than 53 microns. And then we have clay, which is our smallest particle. You can't even see it under a microscope. It tends to just make water really murky. And clay, I'm focusing on clay because clay is our very chemically reactive part of the soil. And so a lot of times we can estimate a lot of properties of our soil if we just know the clay content of it. And that's because clays, being so small, they have a very high surface area, and as well as they carry a negative charge. And so because they're charged, if they work just like magnets. And so if they're positively charged, ions, a lot of our plant nutrients are positively charged, they can stick to those clays and they'll stay there and they won't get washed away. But another implication for that stickiness is that soil carbon sticks to it. And when I say soil carbon, I really mean the molecules that contain carbon. Carbon in and of itself doesn't really exist, by itself. So it's in these different biomolecules and it's stuck to clays. And so I mentioned that now because that ends up being an important part of when we talk about soil carbon sequestration. And I think it's kind of an interesting and also kind of rule of thumb. So if you have very sandy soil, your potential for storing soil carbon is going to be less than if you have more clay in your soil. So I did a little background research on the Roaring Fork Valley, just kind of for fun. And in our soil maps, we can see that the major soil types of the Roaring Fork are the azultine and the Atencio complexes. So these are, you can look them up online. The USDA has descriptions. They are mollisols, which are nice, thick, rich grassland soils. But based on their taxonomy, I know from the name here, they're aritic argiostol, so they're Atencio, which means it's a very dry, sort of kind of on the driest side of grassland soil, and there's a little bit of clay moving through it. And these soils specifically, as you will probably not be surprised to know, are developed from river sediments that have been deposited in the area and soil has formed from there. So just for kind of reference, this is a typic of sort of our type species of the Argiostol, and this is from South Dakota, and you can see the soil pit. You can see this nice horizonation where we have our A horizon at the top, it's nice and dark, and then as we move down, we see different soil layers that are named based on certain criteria that the soil scientists named on here. But what we can see at the top is this nice darkness at the top. And so as you I have a question here, as you will probably guess, that darkness is caused from the addition of soil organic matter. So now we will kind of start discussing soil organic matter. But before we get into that, I want to introduce this concept that's really important when we think about ecosystem ecology. And that's the concept of pools and fluxes. So pools are just chunks of stuff and they're measurable. And so we like to think of it, a great example is a bathtub. That the bathtub is a pool of water and we can measure it. We know based on the volume of your tub and how full it is, we can tell you how much mass of water there is. But if we turn the faucet on and we open the drain, what is going to happen to that pool of water? And as you can, guess pretty intuitively, if our flux in our faucet is running faster than our flux out, our drain, we will over time increase the size of our bathtub water pool. And same as for the reverse. So this is a great introductory understanding when we take about pools and fluxes. Now to a slightly more complicated example, we can also think about the human body as a pool, and we can think about the human body as a pool of carbon. So humans are approximately 18% carbon, and so a 70 kilogram human would have about 12.6 kilograms of carbon in them. I did some quick back of the envelope calculations today for fun, and if you were to eat 2,000 calories of just sugar, just to make things simple, you're eating 3.2 kilograms of carbon. And then through respiration, you're breathing out about 1 kilogram of carbon per day. That carbon goes back into the atmosphere where it is then fixed by plants, and those plants are harvested into food. And that is generally, from a very anthropomorphic perspective, how the carbon cycle works. But then the question is, where does all the other carbon go? And that's going into, cellular repair, growing our cells, maybe growing our waistlines, depending on how much we're eating. And so we can really think about kind of the balance of carbon in our bodies as this balance between how much we're, breathing out or exercising, and that's where that carbon goes. When we exercise, we breathe more, we breathe out, and what we're putting into our bodies. Another kind of concept that I want to introduce here as well is that we don't necessarily want to just know like total carbon in our bodies, but we might be interested in the relative proportion of carbon in fat versus carbon in muscle versus carbon in our bones. So those are ways that we can partition the carbon in our body into these different sort of functional pools of carbon that have different functions, right? Fat has a different function than muscle in our body. And so though we could, measure total carbon of the human body, dividing them into the different types, the functional pools is important for better understanding kind of your health. And so with this renewed understanding of how pools and fluxes work, I'm showing you this rather complex diagram of the global carbon cycle. But as you will, take from your knowledge that you just gained, you now can identify these different important pools of carbon in the global carbon cycle. So up in the left, we have the atmosphere, we have plant biomass, and we have the soil, as well as a bunch of other carbon pools. And then these arrows represent the fluxes. So the flux of carbon from the atmosphere into plant biomass is photosynthesis, right? When plants are taking carbon dioxide and they are literally taking carbon out of thin air and making it into sugars that they build into their plant material. And then that can either go to soil carbon or be respired. And so the kind of the fraction of carbon that's lost, we call respiration, and that's the breathing out. And pretty much everything on Earth breathes out, or everything on Earth does, all living things. Most things that aren't microbial are breathing out carbon dioxide. Okay, so we have this quick introduction to the carbon cycle. And so now I'm going to transition into agriculture and soil. So over the past 2,000 years, we have gotten ourselves into a soil carbon debt. This is a graph that just shows the change in the soil carbon pool over time. And you can see that in cropland, it's about 35 petagrams. It's even larger than that in grazing lands. And that's not because, and that's mostly because grazing lands just take up a larger proportion of the Earth's surface. And so we can see here from this estimation that we have a lot of ground to cover in terms of putting carbon back into the soil to not only restore, the carbon balance, but also in many cases restore soil fertility. So very briefly, you're going to be familiar with something like this before. This is another pool and flux diagram. But what I want to show you is this is kind of our general understanding of how soil carbon is formed in the first place. So there's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it gets fixed by plants, the plants die, and that dead material is then cycled and decomposed. So when things sort of rot, they change their form, they transform by being eaten by soil microbes. And then this is where the magic sort of happens. And this is what in kind of our discipline we're really interested in, and is what is this fraction that is stabilized as soil organic matter? And what is the fraction that is then breathed out by the soil microbes back to CO2? And of course, managing this balance is something we really want to maintain and try to, reduce CO2 loss. Now you might say, so the obvious question here then, of course, is if the microbes are getting rid of all the soil carbon, should we just kill the soil microbes? And this is a dilemma of how to manage soil carbon that we are kind of at the forefront of, because even though soil microbes digest soil carbon and are the reason why it gets lost in the first place, they're also absolutely essential to recycling nutrients of dead material. If we got rid of all the soil microbes, we wouldn't be able to harness the nitrogen, the phosphorus, all those limiting plant minerals that need to be released back and to make way for new life. And so this is really kind of the crux of our dilemma here when we talk about managing for soil organic matter, is how do we sequester carbon, but also keep the cycle going so that nutrients can be released for plant growth. Now this balance is shown sort of here. I'm not going to show this map for too long, but the point I want to make with this map, so this shows different levels of soil organic carbon throughout the United States, and you can see that it varies greatly. And this is a combination of the weather, how much plants can grow, how fast they decompose, and also the underlying soil type and the soil's inherent ability to store carbon. All right, so how does carbon stay in soil? So carbon, as we said, is part of organic material, which is biomolecules that we're familiar with, carbohydrates, lipids, fats, all these things that make up living things. Our historical perspective on why some of that carbon will stay in the soil and some of it gets eaten by microbes and gets breathed out is the chemical composition of the material. So things like wood or lignin, which is the really difficult to decompose stuff. You can, when your leaves are dying in your yard, you'll see kind of the veins that stay, but the rest of it leaves. So there's different levels of decomposability or how edible it is. So our historical perspective is that some of these materials are well protected, and so microbes can't access them. They're safe. That carbon is safe. It's going to stay in the soil and we don't have to worry about it. However, our emerging perspective is actually that easier to decompose. So candy-like soil carbon, it's eaten by the soil microbes, and then it's those soil microbes themselves, once they die and their body parts kind of explode, they'll get stuck to the soil particles. And as I mentioned before, I told you that clay was going to come into the picture here, but clay, because it's negatively charged, as well as iron oxides, are very sticky, and they can stick that soil organic matter and protect it from other microbes eating it. And that's really what we're talking about when we say stabilizing soil carbon. So I like to think about it as a plate that has dried food stuck to it. You know how it's really hard to get it off? Soil organic matter that's stuck to those clay particles is really hard to scrape off, and the microbes are probably not going to be able to access it. So this is one major mechanism of soil carbon sequestration. There's a couple others, including the formation of aggregates that I don't have time to talk about today, but generally we think about clays as being one of the major driving factors in the ability of soil to store carbon. But the reason why soil carbon is so politically kind of safe and exciting to people is because not only does it store carbon, but it has all these co-benefits or additional benefits to our ecosystem and to farm profitability that make it sort of a win-win-win. So soil organic matter provides nutrients. So as I said before, the cycling of the nutrients is really important, and that slow cycling compared to like when you add fertilizer makes our ecosystems much more sustainable. We don't lose those nutrients as much. And so soil organic matter and clay can stick to those nutrients and hold on to them as well. So that's an added benefit. Soil organic matter also increases aggregation, which as you can see from this kind of diagram on the right, creates this nice kind of crumbly soil. You might be familiar with it. So instead of kind of creating like a brick, it has all these pore spaces. And that allows plant roots and water and air to travel through the soil. And you can sort of feel it, that nice airspace. And then of course, it also feeds soil organisms. I'm sure you're all familiar with earthworms, and earthworms feed on soil organic matter. Okay, so I know we're running through a lot of things right now, but hopefully you're finding this really exciting. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat and I'll try to get to them at the end here. Let me check the time. Okay, so Measuring soil carbon. This is kind of one of the main cruxes that I mentioned when we talk about soil carbon markets. And so I'm not going to go through in huge detail here, but essentially the gold standard in measuring soil carbon is you actually take a chunk of soil, you grind it down, and you explode it in a machine, and you measure the carbon dioxide that comes out. It's not crazy expensive. It's about $5 a sample when you send it out to the lab. But when you're talking about, all those different soil horizons that I mentioned, right? We saw how in that picture, the soil organic carbon was really high at the surface and then kind of went down. So you can't take one sample from that spot and think that you know what the soil carbon is. So you have to take lots of different samples, and it will change over, a space. You might notice in your own backyard that you have one area that grows really well and another area that's really gravelly. And so that heterogeneity or the variation across space ends up being a huge issue. So one approach that is in development right now, and I'll talk a little bit more about the folks that are doing this, but is trying to use remotely sensed data. And remote sensing is a fancy word for saying satellite images that are processed into these different layers and give us pretty good scale information on things like how green it is, which gives us an idea about the vegetation or the plant growth. We have these maps of soils. We have maps of hydrologic or water regimes. And so kind of a goal in the field right now is try to take all of these different pieces of information and see if we can estimate the soil carbon in a space. This is obviously tricky for a lot of reasons, and so it's why it's still really important to go out and take these soil cores and measure the soil in the ground. A big piece of why we care too is that carbon storage is different in different ecosystems. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but I just want to kind of bring to your attention that on the left side, we have these tropical ecosystems, and you can see that the green bars are quite big here because of there's a lot of above ground carbon storage in trees and all kinds of plants. Whereas if we move kind of to the middle into a warm, temperate, dry, which I would say is kind of where Colorado and the Great Plains are, most of our carbon is stored below ground. And then as we sort of move to the right even more, we are in boreal, which is our really cold areas, maybe our permafrost. We're seeing crazy amounts of carbon stored below ground in the soil. And so this variation, again, is one of the challenges that we get to when it comes to measuring soil carbon. All right, so soil carbon in Colorado, I'm going to kind of go quickly through this, but essentially one of the challenges we have in Colorado is that it's very dry, and also we have cold winters. And so our ability to grow plant biomass that we need to be able to turn that into soil organic carbon is limited. Management, especially agricultural management, has a large effect on soil organic matter. And so as we know from when we think about our pools and fluxes, when we till the soil, the microbes get all activated, and so they blow off more carbon. Or when we remove straw, we're reducing the amount of dead carbon that goes back into the soil. We can also do things like add cover crops or integrate livestock. And the livestock integration is really critical because it adds a perennial component to it. And that's what we're going to be talking about more today, is grazing systems. But I really want to highlight that what we're seeing, and I'll be discussing this in a little bit, is that transitioning from cropland to grassland to a pasture is one of the key strategies to increase soil carbon. And so this is something that we're trying to figure out how to integrate to kind of balance crop production and grazing. I'm going to skip through this. But so here again, you can see down at the bottom, this is a study from Rich Conant, who's at CSU, and he does a lot of great work in carbon modeling. And you can see at the bottom where I have my arrow that our land use conversion from agriculture is expected to sequester, close to 0.8 to 0.9 megagrams of carbon per hectare per year, which, it's that carbon deficit that I mentioned at that first graph where we saw we're able to get that carbon back. We've also seen This is in this Colorado shortgrass steppe that I won't spend too much time here, but I wanted to just mention that we have seen in Colorado in dry areas that grazing actually has been shown to increase soil carbon or total ecosystem carbon. But this, I did kind of go through this study and there are some limitations to it. It's not well replicated. They were there for quite some time, but they attributed this change in soil carbon mostly due to changes in the composition in the actual species that were growing there. So it took quite a bit of time, but they did see a difference. So all this is to say that there's a high amount of ecosystem diversity, that where soils exist, which is all over the earth. That's not the ocean. And so it's a big unknown for soil carbon. And that means that we need a lot more data to try to figure out what factors can help us predict what's happening with the soil carbon. And so that gets us down to this last part of my talk today, where I'm really excited to share. I'm not going to share too many results today because we only just processed some of the data, but a study that I did in cooperation with with ACEs at Rock Bottom Ranch down in Basalt. And so kind of the background for this work is that we know that permanent pasture can help store soil carbon by decreasing soil erosion, and deep-rooted perennial grasses are good at putting carbon below ground. Also, pastures take up a huge amount of the global land area, and there's a lot of kind of space for improvement when it comes to grazing management. So we know that proper grazing may increase soil carbon, but we don't really know what the conditions are. So what we did was we took the West pasture. This is a map of the West pasture, and we set up a replicated experiment. So we have two different treatments, a grazed and an ungrazed exclosure, as you can see in this picture up here blown up. And we replicated this 4 times, and that allows us to be more confident with our results and take into account variability across the field. And you can see that we were able to, have kind of big differences. There's some great photos from Jennifer down at the ranch. So after 3 years, I shouldn't say we, it was mostly the Rock Bottom staff, kept those exclosures there. They didn't let the cattle go on there. And then after 3 years, I came out with a Gidding soil probe. And this is a truck mounted probe. It's a hydraulic motor in the back of the truck that allows me to take this tube and insert it into the soil, basically as deep as it'll go. We went down to about 80 centimeters, the 60 centimeters for the most part in these soils, but we kind of bottomed out. And so the way that the sampling worked is we have, here's an example of our site. And this is one replicate. We had our ungrazed and our grazed. I took 3 samples from each, and I took my grazed samples like kind of on the sides of the ungrazed to try to minimize variability. So it was like as similar soil as possible, and just changing that grazing management. I took 3 soil cores and then divided them by depth. And we divide by depth because, as you can see in this photo, which is a reminder, soil changes a lot by depth. And so if you're going to get different patterns, and it's better to see fine scale resolution by dividing our soil by depth like that. So we took the 3 cores from each of the soil treatment and we collect them, and that was sort of our 1 soil sample. So I'm going to run through just quickly the lab methods that I used here. So we took the weights of the soil to figure out kind of that proportion of pore space to soil mass that I mentioned at the beginning, how much air was in there. And then I passed it a 2 millimeter sieve, and I took this extra step because I was really interested in the roots. And so I separated all the roots and I washed them and I weighed those. And then I did something called a soil fractionation. So similar to what we talked about earlier about how you sort of have different pools of carbon in your body, there's also we think that there are these different pools of carbon in soil. And so I wanted to divide those up and see if each of them were responding differently to our management treatment or to different things like depth. So I divided it into water dissolvable soil. So if I shake it in water and what carbon comes out, just basically making tea out of the soil. And then I divide it into sand size fraction, that's greater than 53 microns, and our silt and clay size fraction. And then I analyzed all of these and the whole soil for carbon and nitrogen content. So here are some fun results. I'm just going to show them by depth right now because they're the most dramatic, and I think it's just fun to get a better understanding of how kind of soil works. So first here, the graph I'm showing you is our mineral associated carbons. That's carbon in that really small silt and clay fraction. And that's carbon we think is more stabilized because it's stuck to those clay minerals. And you can see here we have in the top of our soil, our top 15 centimeters, our soil carbon content is 4.2%. That is a very high for Colorado soils. Usually I'm measuring things out in the plains and like 2%. So we have, and this makes sense, right? We have a lot of water, these are irrigated, and then we don't have a ton of decomposition because of the cold weather. So I think both those together have contributed to fairly high levels of soil carbon. And then, so that's the top one is our percentage, and then our bottom panel is our stock. And so that is total carbon. So if you were to take just like a slice, like a CD-ROM of the soil, how much carbon is in each of those layers, each of the discs. And you can see that, we're running close to 40 megagrams of carbon per hectare. And so when we add those all together, so this is just for one of our fractions. And so I'm just going to kind of blow through. This is, don't worry so much about these. I just want you to see that in our particulate carbon, this is our larger sand size carbon, the carbon that's not stuck to silt and clay. We have still a similar pattern, but a lower carbon concentration, which is to be expected. But kind of cool to see at the top how much greater it is at the surface. And that's because we have a lot of partially decomposed root bits that haven't really kind of cycled through the whole soil carbon forming process yet. And then this is just kind of fun. I put the roots in, which is kind of a lot of work, but I thought it was interesting. Okay, and so some final numbers here in terms of how much carbon is in the West pasture. So I took the average soil carbon concentration across all of the stocks in each of the quadrants. And then I took an average, which was 144 megagrams of carbon per hectare, and then multiplied that by the number of hectares. And we got our megagrams of carbon, which is 2.8 hectares, which is the same thing as 7 acres. And so doing this calculation sort of back of the envelope, the amount of carbon stored in this pasture is equivalent to the annual emission of 91 vehicles, according to the EPA. And so I kind of mentioned this before, but my hypothesis is that we have this high water, high plant growth, but also inhibiting decomposition. So we're just getting some really nice soil carbon levels. All right, so briefly, we're running out of time, but I just want to mention a couple really exciting things that are happening in Colorado. The CSU just recently started the Soil Carbon Solutions Center, which is a group of researchers in soil and crop, the ag and economics, and different sort of entities coming together to try to work on some of these really difficult soil carbon questions that we've discussed here today. So keep a lookout for what they're up to, and if you have land that you're interested in doing some measurements on or are interested in getting in touch, just reach out to me and I can get you in touch with that group. There's also an exciting new program that is kind of up and coming, which is the STAR program. That stands for Saving Tomorrow's Agriculture Resources. And this is this voluntary program that producers or farmers can fill out a survey and figure out how sustainable their cropping practices are. And hopefully there'll be time down the line where, when you go to the supermarket or go to your local, any sort of local market, you can see the STAR rating for the farm that produced that material. And, hopefully they'll be able to get some sort of premium. So we're trying to figure out how we can incentivize soil health practices, soil carbon building practices in a way that gives the consumer sort of more transparency and also helps give farmers better ideas of what they can be doing. And so I'm going to close out now. But before I just want to leave you with one last idea before we go, which is this idea of wedges, which was developed by Courtland in 2004. And so this graph here that I have shown, this is our fossil fuel emissions trajectory. The BAU, that's business as usual. So this is if we don't change anything, continue at our regular growth rate, what we're expecting to see. The curve at the bottom is our ideal scenario of what we need to get down to in terms of changing our emissions to be able to reach our 500 parts per million target and avoid catastrophic global warming. And so this green triangle is quite foreboding, right? It's a big chunk of emissions that we need to get rid of. And it can be really overwhelming, really kind of easy to point fingers at other people or other countries to figure out like how are we going to change this trajectory. And what Pakala and Sakalau suggest is that we really need to start thinking about these as wedges or triangles within this kind of larger triangle. Each small individual action doesn't completely change the trajectory of the curve, but together, all of these small things do eventually get us to where we need to go. And so when we think about soil carbon, we know that soil carbon can be affected by management, but the predictions are difficult due to, just the craziness of ecosystems. Increasing soil carbon has all these other benefits, though, and so it's important to keep those in mind that we still want to increase soil carbon because they help with a lot of other ecosystem services. So I suggest that soil carbon is an important wedge to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but it is limited. We can't just rely on soil carbon to kind of drown out all the other emissions that are taking place. So it's a both and we need to remember that we can be hopeful, but we also don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. So finally, our soil carbon is one necessary element of our negative emissions, which we also need to be doing, right? We need to actually take emissions out of the atmosphere, but it can't replace lack of action in other sectors. So that's all that I have for you today. Thank you so much for your attention. I have my email at the bottom. So I'm going to leave this slide up here. We can start doing some questions. And if you have others that we don't have time to get to, please feel free to reach out. And I'd love to hear from you. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Courtland. Yes, please put your questions in the Q&A. We'll try to get to a few, just being respectful of your time. And again, Courtland's email is there for you to ask more questions if you have them. But there were a few questions, Courtland, around the value of carbon sequestering versus the carbon associated with livestock. If you could speak a little bit about that.
Absolutely, yes, that's a tough one. One slide that I didn't show for time, but I will go ahead and show this just because it's really relevant to that, so this is some model data, and each of these scenarios is assuming if we kind of take regular livestock production and convert it into our kind of management intensive or, this is AMP stands for adaptive multi-paddock grazing. It's our best gold standard of grazing practices. And, it's tough. Some people, based on the modeling, they show that the net emissions from converting cropland to pasture land, you can sequester enough carbon to offset the methane emissions. But I do agree that it's tricky. And I think that my answer would be, we still need to reduce our meat consumption. Most of the meat produced globally is super high in terms of our emissions. And if you are going to eat meat, try to get something that's pasture raised and hopefully managed in a responsible way.
Thank you. Yes, and there was just a little clarification about what you said about either keeping the soil microbes, and how they eat carbon, so we might mistakenly want to kill them. But if you could just clarify just your comment around keeping the microbes versus. taking them out?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know that's a little bit confusing. So here's where we're talking about that. Yeah, so soil microbes, they are the ones that blow off all of our soil carbon, but we need them. And they are a critical component of how we build soil organic matter. And so even though we're trying to kind of reduce the activity of the microbes in some ways, or increase their efficiency of building microbe to how much they breathe out. We do need soil microbes. They're very important. And based on kind of our new understanding that I mentioned here, we actually believe that increasing this total number of soil microbes helps to increase our soil organic carbon sequestration. So it's confusing because it honestly is that really challenging, it kind of pulls both ways. And so it's managing that dynamic stock. It's the whole cycle. We can't, kind of freeze things in time and think that that's going to help.
And there's a question about, can you introduce soil microbes into the soil?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So there are lots of products on the market today that are sort of inoculants or things that that say that you can introduce soil microbes. I haven't seen anything super convincing that soil microbes that you add will necessarily stay there. So the soil is like a really funky place. It's really difficult for microbes to grow. So I would, my personal understanding as a scientist is you want to feed your microbes, but you don't necessarily need to add them. There are so many microbes in the soil already there. So just feed them, give them lots of carbon, compost, dead stuff, leaves and things like that. Increase your soil microbes, and over time you're going to increase your microbial biomass. They'll breathe more, but they'll also sequester more. So it's kind of both.
Thank you for that clarification. This one's from Kathleen. She says, thanks for your talk. She is also a livestock and vegetable farmer and also a current ACES naturalist. And she said, you talked a bit about carbon sequestered through decomposing matter, plant matter, but how does this compare to the amount of carbon sequestered throughout the plant's life? Microbes along the root system, and especially in regards to perennial crops and pasture?
Yeah, great question. So to get to the first part of the question, roots do, I didn't really get into this. This is kind of what I did for my dissertation, but roots secrete sugary substances through their roots, and that feeds soil microbes, and that can be sequestered into soil carbon. And it's a really kind of, there are papers that recently came out that show that, but it's a really kind of, thin film along the root surface where that's happening. So when it comes to total carbon sequestered, the whole plant in of itself is probably more important. And as you mentioned, the roots are really important. And so that's what we see in like perennial grazing systems, is that those the deep rooted perennial grasses that are getting that root carbon like deep into the soil, and it's really in close contact. And so we think that the actual like root structures are stabilized more than the kind of grass above ground. And then I think the second part was sort of around the life cycle of the plant, which hopefully I answered. But yeah, things like trees are going to sequester a lot of carbon in their biomass, but grasses, it's much more below ground.
Thank you. There's a question about how big ag is reacting to all of this. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. We could talk for a long time about this, but what I will say about this is, I think that soil carbon markets are this cool opportunity where we are generating some capitalist will. I won't say political will, because I'm going to say capitalist will to put a price on carbon. And there are companies that see it in their best interests to either say they're net carbon neutral or to buy carbon offsets, things like that. Unfortunately, what we are also seeing is that similar to how sort of agriculture financialization and industrialization happened, throughout the 1900s and before that, is that a lot of the wealth is concentrated and like the benefits are concentrated in certain groups of people that look a certain way and have a certain amount of wealth already. And so one thing that I hope that we can really move forward in is figuring out how to be more equitable with who can benefit from these soil carbon and ecosystem service markets. And if there's a way for your smaller farmers or your more kind of diverse growers to be able to capitalize on this and not just be these large farms that are already getting subsidized, that are getting all of the money. So I think my answer is, I think we need to be really thoughtful about it. And I'm not an expert in carbon markets, so I'm not going to pretend that I know exactly what's going on, but it's definitely something that I'm concerned about. And I think that, if we're re-envisioning this whole market of like goods that don't even exist really, why can't we do it in a way that is like more bold and really reflects our values as a society? So that's what I hope we can do.
All right. Is there any relationship between sequestering CO2 and fixing nitrogen? Are legumes better sequesters and better nitrogen fixers? ?
Yeah, that's a great question. So something that I really missed on this story that I didn't have time to talk about was the fact that when we're sequestering carbon, we pretty much always are doing that with nitrogen. And as you probably know, the reason why my example of just living on sugar obviously doesn't work is we all know that you need to eat protein because our body has protein in it and there's nitrogen in protein. So living things need nitrogen. That's just flat out. And living things make the carbon that goes into soil organic matter. So yes, we need nitrogen. One of the main kind of criticisms of the soil carbon, push to sequester soil carbon is that, oh my gosh, like the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that we need to make to build the biomass to sequester this carbon is going to offset because it takes all this energy to make nitrogen fertilizer. Yes, but legumes like beans and peas, and there's some trees that also do this, they partner with soil with a certain genus of soil microbe that is able to take nitrogen out of thin air, similar way that plants can take carbon out of thin air, and turn it into biologically available nitrogen. So my answer is, if we're going to sequester all this carbon, we really need to be thinking about legumes, because if we're just fertilizing our land with chemical fertilizers, we are basically negating any emissions benefits that we're getting from sequestering carbon.
All right, just looking at the time, I think this will be our last question, but can you comment on no-till agriculture and how this plays into carbon sequestration?
Oh yeah, I'm glad that you know about no-till. So all my dissertation work was on no-till, and no-till is super fascinating because, so let's quick background. No-till is a way of practicing agriculture that is pretty popular in eastern Colorado in the wheat systems, where you don't till the land and then you get these special planters that can like cut through the straw that's still on the surface. And so it's a different way of doing ag. It takes different equipment, but it saves a lot of soil moisture because you're not mixing the soil. It doesn't dry out as much. And in the surface, at least, it does seem to sequester carbon. However, there are some interesting studies that are coming out lately that are showing that in no-till, even though we're gaining carbon in the surface soil, a lot of people weren't measuring all the way down to like 1 meter, which is how deep our soils are. They're really deep out in eastern Colorado. And we are still finding soil carbon loss down there. So it's an ongoing area of research, but soil scientists are like the deep carbon question is something that a lot of us are really interested in. And that's something that I'm going to be working on, a project I'm going to be working on in my next position that I'm going to be starting in a month or so.
Thank you so much, Courtland. We have a few unanswered questions that we have a recording of them, and we'll hopefully be able to get some answers out to you, or again, you can email Courtland. But thank you all so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks in person at Hallam Lake, and then we will be live streaming again on Wilderness Workshop and ACE's Facebook page. But thank you so much, Courtland. It was great to see you. Thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful Thursday. Bye.
Recording stopped.
That was awesome, Courtland.
Sweet, thanks.
Great.
Did it meet your expectations?
Totally, you covered so much. My God.
I know. I kind of felt bad, but then I was like, it's gonna be recorded. People can go back.
Yeah, for sure. I've got to go back. There's a question about the candy bar. The guy was like, wait a minute, that's a 7-pound candy bar.
I'm going to cancel us all out because there's still
people out there.
Yeah, I was going to mention it's still live.
It said it stopped recording. All right.
Thank you so much, Courtland.
Thank you so much, Courtland. I'm with Wilderness Workshop. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to introduce myself at the beginning, but great presentation.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It was great.
Yeah.
Bye.